Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the fear of psychic power, or psychic functioning, or Psi, as parapsychologists call it. With me is Professor Charles Tart, who is emeritus professor at the University of California, Davis, and also emeritus professor at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. Dr. Tart is the author of over 100 papers on parapsychology and numerous books, including Open Mind, Discriminating Mind, Psi, Scientific Studies in the Psychic Realm, Waking Up, and of course, the classic anthology, Altered States of Consciousness. Welcome again, Charlie.
Good to be here, Jeff.
It's a pleasure to be with you. It truly is.
I don't know how much of a pleasure it's going to be to talk about fear of Psi. I hate fear myself, but we'll see.
Well, the interesting thing about fear of Psi is that many people, even in the parapsychology community, are in denial that there is such a thing as fear of Psi, and yet we live in a culture in which people were, a few hundred years ago, burnt at the stake for ostensible psychic powers.
Mm-hmm. It is funny if you think about it historically, because the human race has always believed that some people have malevolent psychic abilities. And if you could hire them to work on your side, that may be socially acceptable. Mm-hmm. But the very idea of having them out there, you get hysterical mob reactions every once in a while. Some old lady gets burned because she looks funny. And yet, somehow we're now at a rational stage of society where we consider such thoughts crazy and nonsensical.
One of my former mentors, who you probably remember, Arthur M. Young, used to say that the archetype, the epitome of a paradigm shift is witchcraft, where one era we say witches must be burnt at the stake, and the next era we say, oh, witchcraft doesn't exist.
That's quite a shift.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's not uniform. And I think the reality is that there's still a lot of fear about it, mm-hmm. most of which is dealt with by never thinking about it.
Yeah.
Common human way of handling problems.
Well, I know as a parapsychologist, and I'm sure you've had the same experience, I think everyone in parapsychology probably has, where we give a lecture and somebody comes up afterwards and they preface their remarks by saying, I have never told this to anyone before.
I've heard that line.
I have never told this to anyone, but let me tell you, I need to talk to somebody.
The most interesting versions of that have been people who've come up to me and saying that, and they're scientists, sometimes prominent scientists, mm-hmm. and they would never mention it to any of their scientist colleagues because they would be considered crazy or, mm-hmm. Getting senile or something like that. That's why I started this website, the Archives of Scientists' Transcendent Experiences, to give them a place to mm-hmm. express psychic and spiritual experiences that were out of the ordinary. That turned out to be a very interesting project because I figured, okay, a lot of these people need to get it off their chest somehow, but they're sensible enough to realize it's not socially acceptable. So I set up the website so people who were scientists could write me and I'd know who they were, but then they could post their experience anonymously. Mm-hmm. Well, while I ran the website, I closed it down eventually for lack of time to keep it up, but while I ran it, about half of them chose to be anonymous and the other half didn't. But it was interesting, the ones who were okay with using their real names were almost completely scientists who'd retired and didn't have to worry anymore about what their colleagues thought. Yeah. So the taboo against thinking something psychic happens can still be very strong.
And very real. I mean, scientists will lose prestige, sometimes their positions, often their funding, simply for being publicly associated with parapsychology.
We know the example, for instance, of Nobel Prize winner Brian Josephson, who expressed an interest in parapsychological things and finds stuff like he gets uninvited to conferences which he was originally going to be a star speaker at because he's associated with the paranormal. Really, this is weird, unscientific behavior.
So there is a sense in which the social stigma around parapsychology is not so different than social stigmas associated with sexual deviancy or racial stigmas or all sorts of other social prejudices. In fact, I think most of the others are being addressed now. We see, like the legalization of gay marriage, but parapsychology hasn't yet achieved the kind of social leverage where we get to have a large-scale addressing of that fear.
I used to commute to work in a carpool with a lot of women faculty members, and of course they were very much into feminism and the politics of it. And I used to tease them sometimes, thinking, I'm a member of a minority too that gets unfairly persecuted, but we're such a small minority we don't have any leverage.
Yeah. Well, so the fear of being persecuted is a real fear.
Yeah.
Fear of going insane or being thought of as insane, well, that might be real, but I don't know of very many people who have gone insane because they took an interest in parapsychology.
Where would we find any statistics on it?
Yeah.
I do know that certainly a lot of people who have admitted to having psychic and spiritual experiences have been treated very badly.
Yeah.
They've been referred to psychiatrists. Some of them have actually been committed just because they had an unusual experience, and so it must be a sign of craziness. I know I've ended up being a sort of a therapist to some of those people, even though that wasn't part of my life plan. I started training in clinical psychology in graduate school because I thought it would be hard to make a living with my interests, but there was plenty of need for therapists. But I gave it up after a while, thinking, I don't have enough emotional intelligence. And I know the tests and stuff we had back then weren't that good. But I've had hundreds of phone calls and letters and the like over the years from people who will admit to having some sort of what to me is a garden variety psychic experience, but they worried that they were going crazy.
Yeah.
The fact that I, as a professor, as something of an authority figure, could say, no, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going crazy, right? That's a kind of thing that happens to the majority of people, actually, except they never talk about it, so they think it's really weird and worry about it. And it has a name like telepathy or clairvoyance or something like that, and it doesn't mean you're necessarily going crazy. You should still be discreet who you talk to about it, because there are a lot of prejudiced people out there who'll get excited about it. And most of those people have been greatly relieved by 5 minutes of conversation that way. A few, I think, were crazy. I mean, they really needed some mental health. Just because whether you're mentally ill or mentally normal has nothing to do with whether or not you have psychic experiences. They happen to everybody.
Well, I do believe there's some research suggesting that amongst the people who report more spontaneous psychic experiences, they also report a greater incidence of early childhood abuse.
That's certainly been the case for some people who've turned out to be quite psychic later in life also. I'm thinking of Eileen Garrett, for instance, who had an extremely lonely and persecuted kind of childhood. So the only people she could play with were her so-called imaginary playmates and whatnot. And that happens with a lot of people.
So there may be a relationship with imaginary playmates being a kind of doorway into a psychic realm.
I mean, some people are lucky enough to take these unusual things and use them as an opening or as a growth challenge or something like that. But a lot of people just suffer because they're being told it's crazy.
Well, a couple of interesting directions we could take here. I think it's worth mentioning, since you brought up the name of Eileen Garrett. She's considered one of the great mediums and psychics of an earlier era. She's the founder of the Parapsychology Foundation. You knew her personally.
Oh, yes. When I went to college, I went to MIT. I was going to be an engineer, and that put me in Boston. And there was the Exeter Street Theater nearby in Boston that showed a lot of foreign films, which was far out in that day. But also it was owned by a couple of ladies who were spiritualists, and they brought spiritualists and parapsychologists, spiritual teachers and the like, in to give lectures. And I started going to those, and one of them was Eileen Garrett. And I'm the kind of student that's lecturers love, because I have questions and ask interesting things. So pretty soon I was being invited back to tea afterwards with the speakers and met Mrs. Garrett that way. And she was something. I'd never known anybody else like her.
She did a lot to promote the acceptance of psychic functioning through her foundation.
I don't know, actually. She certainly helped a lot of researchers by giving them small grants so they could actually get started on research. She gave me my first grant to do some research in parapsychology, using hypnosis to try to see if people could have out-of-the-body experiences. And it was amazing. She gave me a $100 grant, which was a fortune to me back then, so I could buy a tape recorder and stuff. And at the end of the grant, I was writing up the report, and I told her I had something like $5.50 left over. Should I send it back? And she said, no, keep the change. Grants aren't like that anymore.
Well, it's interesting that a lot of that early parapsychology research actually, in effect, funded by a woman who was a psychic.
Yes. Yes. And she herself was also a very successful businesswoman. Probably one of the early feminists, making it quite clear women could do just fine here.
Had a publishing company.
And her foundation still exists. I've known her daughter and her granddaughter. Her granddaughter, Lisette, still runs the foundation. And I was just talking with her recently on how important it is to have an organization that's got continuity over the years, and it doesn't have much money to give to people, but a little small grants here and there can be the things that trigger people off to start them on a research career.
But another way to look at the fear of psi is how it influences not just the researchers and people who are having psychic experiences, but the skeptics as well, the irrational scoffers.
The pseudo-skeptics, yes. Yes, as I've said before, I like the idea of skeptics because skeptic is an honorable role. It means you're looking at the current explanation of something and you don't think it's very good. You're curious and you'd like to see a better explanation, so you help search for the truth. But the people who call themselves skeptics with respect to parapsychology now, in almost all cases, they're not interested in helping to look for the truth. They already know the truth, which is that parapsychological stuff can't possibly happen, so they attack the research. It's like they're defending a religious orthodoxy against heresy, but trying to pretend that they're being scientific and rational. I'm very disappointed in the skeptics. I mean, I'm a skeptic in the sense that I don't think our explanations about most things are very good. I'm all for finding other ones, but that means I have to take a chance on some of the ideas I think I know the truth about are wrong.
So it seems to me it's reasonable for a psychologist such as yourself to begin to question the motives of these skeptics, or not their conscious motives, but their unconscious motives.
Yes, I'd very much like to do that because many of these pseudo-skeptics are highly intelligent people, and many of them are scientists in some other area of science, but they don't follow the rules of science, If I think somebody's research is coming to the wrong conclusions, I try to see how the research could be improved, not contact funding agencies to stop funding these people or attacking the people or... One of the primary examples happened when I was still very new in this field. There was an article in Science. Now, Science was and still is one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. You publish something in there, it's a big deal. There was an article on Science and the Supernatural by a chemist. I don't know why chemists should know about this, but his basic conclusion was no intelligent person can read the evidence for extrasensory perception and doubt that it exists.
Price was his name, as I recall.
Price, George Price, comma, but
Yeah.
since we know it is impossible, we must conclude all this evidence is due to error and fraud. Whoa, that's religious dogmatism. That's not science.
Yeah.
What in the world was that doing in there? But that was an attitude that was very commonplace and is still too commonplace.
Still common, and on the internet in particular, it's like there are armies of trolls. They often post comments on these interviews, and I keep them there if they're polite. But often they're very rude comments, and I delete them.
When somebody first told me that somebody published a biographical note for me on Wikipedia, I thought, oh, really? So naturally I looked it up, and it was all right. It had been copied from something I'd posted by and large. And once in a while I checked it, and it kept getting changed. So that innocent things that happened in my career now took on a sinister thing. You know, like I taught at the University of Nevada for a year as a distinguished visiting professor, and they wanted me to be interested in staying on, but no, I had other commitments. But they described it as if I'd been asked to leave. Just little things like that. You know. From a Machiavellian point of view, some of these pseudo-skeptics are very good at pushing their case like debaters who winning is the only thing, not the truth.
Well, one of the foremost skeptics, the late Martin Gardner, wrote an autobiographical account of his life and pointed out that he was raised in a fundamentalist Christian family where he learned to fear the devil, be afraid of the devil. And then he became enlightened, and he realized that what he needed to fear was what he called the rising tide of superstition. But it's as if he transferred all that emotion of fearing the devil to now fearing the rising tide of superstition. Not very different, really.
And when he was first making that kind of change, psychology in general still didn't have much of an idea of emotional intelligence, which thank God we're starting to get. So a person can be quite brilliant intellectually, but their emotions take over and distort their things, you know. Gurdjieff talked about the emotional brain is faster than the intellectual brain. Now we know the neurology of that. It's like sensory signals to your senses come in, and they have to go through several neural relays before they get to your consciousness, each one taking a little bit of time. But the path splits into two junctions very quickly, and the shorter path goes to the old emotional brain. So the old emotional brain might pick up on a situation before the intellect even knows something is happening and say, uh-oh, scary, threatening, red alert. And by the time the intellectual brain starts getting the message, you're already all uptight and ready to run or fight or something like that. And your rational mind is just totally distorted.
You're saying something very important here about the human condition, not just about psi and parapsychology. That we are very emotional creatures.
And it turns out that talking about the emotional brain being faster is one of the most useful things I've ever taught to students. Because, you know, when we're too emotionally, we tend to blame ourselves. You know, why can't I control it? How can I be? When you find out that we're hardwired to be faster on the emotions, that gives you more of an opportunity to say, okay, the more primitive part of my brain caught me up, but let me try and relax instead of lashing out or something like that, and give this a little more conscious intellectual thought. Not that emotions should be suppressed, but we've got to have a balance between intellect, emotion, body intelligence, stuff like that. As the emotional brain just is... Its philosophy was expressed in the old Westerns. Shoot first and ask questions later.
That's a good way to put it.
And it's laughable, but it creates an awful lot of useless suffering. Suffering that could have been avoided if somebody had paused a couple of seconds to think about something.
And with regard to our discipline of parapsychology, I think we have a situation today where you have large numbers of people who are afraid for religious reasons. The psychic phenomenon is real, they believe, but it's the work of the devil. Must be avoided. And then you get large numbers of people who are kind of the inverse of that. They think that psychic phenomenon doesn't exist, but we must be afraid of the rising tide of superstition. And a tiny little segment, 1 or 2% of the population, kind of in the middle, who are saying, let's look at it scientifically and see what science might have to say about this.
Unfortunately, I think it's smaller than 1 or 2%. Right? You're sitting with a foremost exponent of it here, and I don't have many people I can talk to about this. I've tried to talk to some religious people. In some ways, they're more hard rejectionists than the people who say that scientifically they're rejecting psychic phenomena, because they already know the truth in their particular religion, and to question it is some kind of heresy that has to be defended against.
Well, I do think, Charlie, from my perspective, doing this video series, and we have hundreds of thousands of views on these videos, that there's a growing segment of the population, you could call them the cultural creatives, or some sort of a rebirth of a kind of secular spirituality or Gnosticism, that segment of the population is growing.
And I plead with them to make me a liar for that last statement, that the percentage is smaller than 1 or 2%.
Yeah.
I mean, we can be rational about this, I think it's possible to, for instance, be faced with a situation and say, well, my spiritual beliefs say it's got to be like so-and-so, and I realize I'm very attached to those particular beliefs, and my motivation for being attached to them is good. But am I really that smart? Am I really so smart that I cannot actually look more closely at what's actually going on and even consider other possibilities? I mean, I think I can envision a kind of experimental spirituality someday where we say, yeah, important things are happening. Let's explore the range of what's happened, and let's explore what the consequences of them are. I mean, dogmatic fundamentalism has a lot of consequences that are extremely negative, whereas an open-minded spirituality can have a lot of positive consequences, as well as being so wishy-washy that it doesn't mean anything. So there's a balance to be learned between spiritual principles that you want to stick to, but being open to learning something new.
I think, though, there's also some deeper issues. We've talked about, some of the irrational fears, but there's also, I think, a psychological dynamic. As somebody opens up to psychic functioning, there are questions about, is my ego going to disappear? Am I going to vanish? Myself as a...
While other spiritual traditions talk about how incredibly hard it is to make that ego vanish.
They do, but there's also a fear associated with that.
Yeah, so let me drop this to a deeper level here. Talk about where I'm coming from on this, okay? In a conventional sense, I'm primarily a scientific person, but from the inside, I think of myself primarily as a spiritual seeker. That doesn't mean I have all sorts of absolute truths that I can work from, but I basically work from the premise that there is an intelligence in the universe. I usually don't call it God because that gets things too excited, but we don't have any other really good words for it. There's an intelligence, a compassion, and so forth. The childhood idea that was given me that we're made in God's image, and presumably God is intelligent, so by using our intelligence we're actually praising God. But I understand also that we're talking about very powerful stuff, as some people experience. It's not just gentle, there, everything is fine, it's all right. It's things are immense.
Could be much more than a little synchronicity here and there.
So there is a legitimate concern for it may be too much. And we have to deal with that somehow. We have to separate it from the irrational fears that somebody else is going to hex me or something like that. But as long as we just kind of squish the whole subject down and try to make it go away, that's not a way to handle it. It doesn't work.
You, for example, have talked about an exercise you sometimes give to your students, saying, I have a pill here.
Yeah.
Let's conclude with that story.
I gave a lecture once for the American Society for Psychical Research in New York City, and big turnout, and afterwards they had a reception for me at headquarters. A lot of parapsychologists, people who had devoted their careers to studying ESP and things like that at great cost to themselves. And I mentioned in a little off-the-cuff talk afterwards that sometimes I thought I was afraid of psychic phenomena that got weird. And I asked, did anybody else ever have that problem? And nobody had. And I thought, well, maybe I'm kind of neurotic that way. But out of 30 or 40 people here in the room, no. I said, no, come on, No, nobody raised the hand. And so I quickly devised this exercise. Look, go, little belief experiment. I've got a pill in my pocket. I'm from California, okay? If you take this pill, you will become telepathic and know the thoughts and feelings of anybody within 100 yards of you. And you'll only have to take the pill once because it's a permanent change. Now, how many want the pill? Nobody said anything. No, I said, how many want the pill? So this philosophical discussion broke out about very abstract things. And I said, no, how many want the pill? And they got filled. And finally I shouted at them, how many want the pill? Okay, nobody wants the pill.
Yeah.
That's very interesting compared to the abstract philosophy. There's a lot of hesitancy and fear about becoming very psychic. Well, and I've since done this in more systematic ways with various groups and had them write down their reasons. And would I become responsible if I found somebody was suicidal near me? Would I be driven nuts by the thoughts of all these people? Maybe there's good reasons we're generally not psychic.
Well, it seems as if the nervous system itself is a filter.
Yes.
It keeps things out, largely. Right. And one of the things that we all protect ourselves against, I believe, is the pain in the world and the suffering of other people. It could be overwhelming if we let it all in. So we let just enough in that we can handle usually.
The other day, my daughter was over and talking to my wife and I, and she started talking about this horrible world event. And after a minute, I told her, I don't want to talk about this because it makes me really depressed and there's nothing I can do about it. So let's not talk about it. And she kept right on talking. And I asked again, could we not? And she kept right on talking. So I said, okay, I'm going to go in the other room and do something for a few minutes. And I walked out calmly. They thought I was so horrible. I said, it's pain I can't do anything about. It'll just make me depressed, and that doesn't make me capable of doing anything more helpful. But yet, by not buying it, it's complicated. I don't have answers. But we have to look at the problem more if we want to hope to find any answers.
Charlie Tart, thank you for sharing this discussion with me. I think this is a very important issue.
Yeah, too important.
Thank you for being with me.
Thank you for the opportunity, Jeff, to bring it up.
Yeah. And thank you for being with us.
And remember to make a liar out of me.